Greetings, listeners. I am your host, Dr. Felicity Kelkros, Associate Professor of Clinical Mental Health Counseling and Psychology of Religion, speaking on behalf of our Christian Theological Seminary Green Faith Initiative podcast series, Be the Change. With me today is Reverend Dr. Carol Johnston, who taught for many years here at Christian Theological Seminary in theology and ethics. She's worked on environmental issues for the Presbyterian Church and the Episcopal Church, teaching in seminaries, congregations, lecturing as far afield as Singapore on issues of economics and environment, justice, Bible and nature, and the public roles of churches. Dr. Johnston is the author of The Wealth or Health of Nations, Transforming Capitalism from Within, and a booklet on the Bible and ecology called And the Leaves of the Tree Are for the Healing of the Nations, Biblical and Theological Foundations for Eco-Justice, which, by the way, is available as a free download on the CTS website, www.cts.edu. So, Dr. Johnston, let's begin with your book. From reading this book, I gathered that it was your dissertation advisor, the famous process theologian John Cobb. And what did he say to you that got you started on all this?
Well, when I met with him to talk about what I would do my dissertation on, I told him that I had already had a passion for both social justice and the environment. And he just looked at me and said, well, if you care about those things, you have to work on economics. And I was pretty stunned because I'm doing a PhD in theology. So how does that compute? And he said, well, the economists think they've got it all figured out and they're basically destroying the planet and someone else is going to have to look at economics because they won't. So I didn't travel 3,000 miles to study with him, not to take his advice. So I took it on and I waded through all the major economists, not having had any economics. It was quite a challenge, but I soon discovered that he was right. They had refined everything into a theory and figured it was all figured out. So they never even looked at their basic premises and assumptions and their understanding of human beings as isolated individuals and, really foundational issues. So I unpacked those as I went, and that's how the book came about.
So now that we're at the place of what's called COP23, the United Nations Climate Change Conference, really trying to bring interest internationally in how to deal with our problems, it does seem that unless you can say something about how we change our economic thinking, we're not going to get very far with solutions. What do you see as the main tenets that need to be revised to get to our goals of sustainability?
Well, there's several, but foundational in the economics is that there's an assumption that the only thing that matters is individual choices in the marketplace. Everything else is defined as an externality. And that means all the social consequences are not taken into account, including what happens to the environment, what happens to communities, what happens to others. All that is extra and somebody else has to deal with that. So we've created an economic system that generates immense damage to both communities and the environment. And anybody who's watched the Rust Belt develop across the U.S. knows what that means, as well as people who've had to deal with the immense costs to both human and ecological health that our way of organizing the economy inherently does. It's built in. The aim of economics, according to Alfred Marshall, who created the theory that we live by across the world now, Alfred Marshall said, we've made the aim of economics unlimited growth in the production of goods. And that's actually a mistake. What we really need to have is growth in the production of health. That if we changed our aim to be not just human, he didn't say this part, but this is where I come in. If we changed our aim to be the health of people and planet, people and ecosystem together, acknowledging that we are not isolated individuals that are not part of the larger whole, but that we are actually very much interconnected with everything, then we would have much better outcomes.
Yeah, we all hear about GDP, gross domestic product, as if that's what makes our well-being. But the way I think of it, in a state of nature, nothing grows without limit except a cancer. So we have become like a cancer on the planet because we think we grow production, and it doesn't bring us health. So how do we move people past this idea that, especially Americans, right, that we've got to keep consuming, because that's what gives us our way of life? You've spoken in seminaries and congregations. What have you found as some pathways to offer people for change?
Well, one of the things I discovered, and this was actually a different project that I did with Lilly Endowment Funding years ago on faith and giving, what I quickly discovered when I interviewed people in congregations across the country was an immense anxiety about having enough money.
Mm-hmm.
Because everything in our culture trains us to think there's not enough and that everybody is incredibly insecure and they think they have to buy it. But when you think you have to buy your security, you can never have enough money. Never.
Mm-hmm.
You got to have your kids in private schools. You've got to live in a safe neighborhood. You've got to have SUVs that cost twice as much as an ordinary car. You have to have extra money in case of emergencies. It's just endless. And one of the interviews that I did in the course of that, where I kept running into all this anxiety, was a young couple in their 20s who weren't like that. They were not anxious. In fact, they were very generous and seemed very secure. And I finally asked them, why are you different? And they looked at each other with this tremendous warmth. And they said, we love our families very much, and they love us. And we all know that if anything happens, we'll all be there for each other. And that's when the light bulb went on. Real security does not come from money. It comes from healthy networks of relationships in family, community, with a healthy environment, and ultimately a spiritual dimension that's also healthy. In other words, if you want people to feel more secure and to feel like they can give up all the guns and the other things that they think make them secure, you have to help them find healthy relationships. And we're seeing this now. If you look at the people who take an AR-15 and go out and murder people, they're almost always very isolated, very lonely, very frustrated, and without healthy relationships. I would argue that it really started with the aftermath of World War II, when GIs came home and all of a sudden we were building suburbs where the extended family that had dominated human life for all of human history was turned into a two-parent and children family isolated in the suburbs, often far from the rest of their family. In other words, we reduced the family to two parents and children, and I would argue that's not viable.
Yeah.
I would especially say to people involved in congregations, especially in church leadership or any other religious leadership, is help people work on their relationships. Help them understand that their relationships matter more than anything. Because we're not going to dig ourselves out of this until we reweave relationships and figure out how to change our social and economic structures to support them.
Right. So that's a great perspective on the kind of anxiety that drives a lot of American society. You know, it's a great paradox, because here we are, supposedly the wealthiest nation, but we're not the most secure and we're not the happiest, for the reasons that you say. We don't have the social networks. They've kind of been ripped apart by this idea that it's the individual that really matters, the choices of the individual, look out for number one. So say more about images that you feel can be transformative, because you've mentioned health as something very concrete. And I know that here in Indiana, people are starting to be aware of the fact that we have terrible infant mortality compared to other states, and especially for Black and Brown people. So should we all be concerned that babies are dying unnecessarily? I mean, what are some of the ways that as a society we can come together to gather around health values as opposed to saying, well, I'm okay, so I don't care what happens to anybody else?
Well, again, there's various aspects to this. One, of course, is a lot of people react with, well, I've just got to concentrate on what I can do, which is my own family. And I call that the scarcity trap. It's thinking it can't possibly be done for everyone. So if there's going to be a scarcity of health or scarcity of resources, then I'm going to make sure I get what I need. And that's kind of at the root of why people don't really act on behalf of others who are outside their circle, because they don't feel like it can be done. So again, the part of the way you get across that barrier is with stories. We had a class for a long time at my church called Faith in Action. And instead of studying issues, which had been done for years, we took an issue and we found someone living it and asked them to come and tell their story. And wow, did that have 100 times more impact. So meeting people who can tell that story and talk about how things happened and what happened to make it better helps people imagine, oh, this can be done. One of the things that we did a few years ago, I helped Judy O'Bannon, our former First Lady, who makes documentaries now on her, like 80 documentaries and 3 Emmys later at the age of 88. Wow. I helped her do one on environmental work in Indiana. And again, we knew we could do the whole thing on what's wrong in Indiana. Right. But instead of that, we sought out people doing great work, people doing the right things. And we deliberately looked for people from every walk of life so that people watching the documentary could find something they could identify with.
That's a wonderful documentary. And the one I remember is in Northeast Indiana, where they had taken away all the wetlands. And then they realized that they were having flooding issues. And so bringing the wetlands back, the farmers found that they actually improved their own crops by having the wetlands there to absorb the floodwaters.
That's another really key concept. And that is figuring out how to work with nature's own dynamic regenerative processes instead of against them. I first heard that concept in a speech made by then Prince Charles in Louisville in 2015, and I had never heard it. And I thought then, well, that really says it. You know, he said that the biggest mistake of the Industrial Revolution was doing everything working against nature, trying to get control of all nature, and instead of learning from and working with nature. And the Pope Francis's encyclical letter on the environment says the very same thing, which came out a few months later. Well, the next spring, I was in a conference on water justice in Lower Manhattan. And we were given small groups and told to pick a real environmental issue in somebody's community and then discuss solutions. And we picked someone from a suburb where the river through the suburb was flooding a lot. And at first, all the solutions brought up were hardscape, engineering solutions. You know, build a dam, build flood walls, do all this stuff. And after 15 minutes, I said, can we take a moment and see if we can think of ways to address this that work with nature instead of fighting against it? Mm-hmm. I was stunned at how instantly the whole conversation changed. immediately people said, oh, well, we should get the community college to study the water flows in the area and identify places where we could put in bioswales to absorb floodwater and use permeable pavements and green roofs and rain gardens. They already knew all those answers, but it never occurred to them to bring it up until it was framed that way. So how you frame the conversation makes all the difference.
I'm thinking about a lot of different things as I'm listening to you. So you were saying earlier, individuals are unhappy when they're disconnected from family and community. And that's like the way nature works. Nature works in interactive systems that rely on each other. So humans are not that different, right? We have to rely on others around us. We're not just monads by ourselves. But how to get away from this narrative that, build a bigger wall and keep strangers out. It's a heavy lift sometimes when those fearful narratives are dominant.
Well, again, one of the reasons people are so afraid of letting immigrants into their community is that they're feeling like nobody knows or cares about them. And you let the immigrants in, and they're the ones who are doing all the dynamic stuff. They're the ones who are building, and they're building a different community. They're not becoming part of our community. That's how they see it. And they're already so insecure. It's very hard for them to accept. So it's really crucial to help people feel seen and understood, to encourage people to talk about what they're worried about and to really listen to them. Absolutely essential. Helping people regain a sense of their own agency. That's another thing that regenerative economics is taking into account, by the way. It also dovetails with the rising movements of social entrepreneurship and asset-based community development. So much of development from World War II on was all about experts going into poor places and telling them what to do and giving them resources to develop and all this stuff.
Right.
It was awful.
Yeah.
All that's being turned on its head now with these new movements, which are starting with the presumption that everybody is gifted. And in every community, no matter what kind of stresses it suffers, no matter what kind of shape the community is in, there are people with great gifts. And what you look for is the gifts. And you encourage people, instead of telling people what to do, see people and make them feel seen and encouraged so that they can themselves figure out what to do. And I've seen this in so many ways lately. And one of the things I've been working on the last year in my biblical work actually is a way of understanding this that I actually get from the first two creation stories in Genesis. One of my students asked once when we were reading the first creation story, what does it mean that God saw that it was good at the end of each day of creation?
Right.
Everything talks about that it was good, and that's important.
Yeah.
But who talks about seeing that it was good, and why does it matter? And as we talked about that, it dawned on us that seeing is theologically crucial. Feeling that God sees you and knows you, that your teacher sees you and knows you. They've actually just come out with a study that shows that children who are with the very same teacher for 5 or 6 years in elementary school do better than children who change teachers every year because they're known and they're well known. And that's what matters more than anything else. And then on the second creation story, one of the things I've been working on is the whole question of stewardship and the stewardship of creation, but also the way stewardship has been interpreted in the churches, which I think is actually caught in a scarcity trap. And I won't go into that right now, but a lot of environmentalists like the idea that we're supposed to be stewards of creation, except for the few who point out that actually creation did very well before we came along. And a lot of other creatures are good stewards themselves.
Right. Yeah.
Fredheim, a biblical scholar, points out in his work that in the creation stories itself, other created things are participants. God puts the sun in charge of the day and the moon in charge and the stars in charge of the night. God tells the oceans to bring forth the sea creatures. God tells the earth to bring forth plants. They're all participating. And one of my favorite stories about great natural stewards of creation are beavers. Beavers do a fabulous job, and with so many benefits to the ecosystems they're in. So the question that came up for me was, what is there something human beings can do distinctively that other creatures can't? I would argue that, yes, we are meant to be stewards in and with the rest of creation. That's part of the charge that you see in being given dominion, which means acting in relation to the rest of creation in the way God does, for the sake of the thriving of the whole. But the thing that is distinctive that occurs to me, I actually got the ideas from the story of Adam naming the animals. Because God brings the animals to the Adam, the earth creature, to see what Adam would name them. Well, you can't name what you don't know well. Every indigenous culture, and certainly in Hebrew, naming is a very important thing. And you have to know what you're naming and know enough about what you're naming to name rightly. So that's when it occurred to me, what is distinctive about human beings is that we have a capacity being made in the image of God, as it were, the God who sees what is good, to see in others the potential that's in them, to encourage it and help it to thrive, to develop and thrive. What if that's what's distinctive about us? That theologically ties right in with asset-based community development, with social entrepreneurship, with all of this that we're discussing. What if leaders all were taught that your job is not so much to get people to do what you want, it's to see in them what their capacities are and their potentials are, and then help them to contribute it to the process so that everything is enhanced.
Yeah. So I'm glad you're continuing to be an educator wherever you are. We didn't even talk about you going to China. I wanted to bring that up. Before we wrap up, how did you get to be going to China and communicating with people there about these issues?
Well, it all started with a young Chinese philosophy professor who got interested in the work of Alfred North Whitehead. And this would have been in the late 1990s. And he found Whitehead, and Whitehead immediately made sense. Whitehead himself actually said once he thought his way of writing was more congruent with Eastern ways of thinking than Western. And so he started translating Whitehead, and he started an academic journal. And eventually they called it Constructive Postmodern Philosophy, as opposed to deconstructive. And it took off in China. And he decided to come to a PhD in Claremont and did a PhD with David Griffin. John Cobb was retired by then. And then he started a program to kind of spread this stuff around China and started having conferences at places in China that were interested. And that's when I got invited to a conference in 2002 on Whitehead's philosophy at Beijing Normal University. Then he started having conferences every other year, basically, in China. And I wasn't able to go to every one, but I have been able to go 3 or 4 times. In 2015, I was invited to speak at a conference on preserving rural culture and agriculture. This was not done by the leader of this program, Dr. Zhe Wang, and his wife, Dr. Meijin Fan. This was one that someone else was putting on and asked him to bring some Americans with him. And I was invited to go to that along with John Cobb and some others. And I found myself at the Academy of Governance in Beijing, which is where all the mayors and governors are trained. So it was a really very big deal. And I found myself in a conversation in a studio. We talked about organic agriculture and the need for it and that stuff. And afterwards, a woman came up to me, and you could tell she was a Chinese official. And she was very concerned. And she said, I think China must industrialize agriculture in order to feed everyone. And I found myself saying, just out of the blue, and I've always been very careful about what I say in China, not because I'm afraid to say what I think, but because I know the history, and Westerners have no business telling the Chinese what to do. But in this case, I said, if you industrialize your agriculture, in no time, you'll discover that you're having to use chemicals on the land, which kills the organisms in the soil, and then you have to put in fertilizers. You're putting stuff to kill weeds and bugs, and that requires bioengineered seeds, and that means the land becomes addicted to all these inputs, which are poisonous, and you become dependent on the Western agribusinesses that provide them, and your people will become addicted to the junk food that's produced, and it will be the opium wars all over again. It just came out of my mouth. I didn't even think about it. I just said it. And the whole room went, I mean, in China, the opium wars, that's a very, very, very big deal. Everybody knows what the West did to China, the opium wars.
Yes, right.
And I thought, oh boy, now I've done it. But as it turns out, my Chinese hosts were really happy I said that. And it really made people think. And I went back and I just started looking up stuff on trying to make an argument for organic agriculture as opposed to industrial. And what I found was just a lot of weeds. I mean, just everything was just so convoluted. It took me about a year to do enough research I tried to write a position paper that explained how we got industrial ag to fight World War II, essentially, when you had an emergency where 18 million young men were off at war and off the farms, but you had to maximize food production to feed everybody. And you didn't care how you did it. So energy inputs, chemical inputs, machinery, substitute for labor, all that stuff was all ramped up big time for the emergency. And then after the war, they converted chemical factories that had been making stuff for the war effort and instead used them for killing weeds. And nobody thought about the consequences. And of course, the consequences proved to be very, very problematic. By the 50s, it was becoming obvious that there were all kinds of problems with it.
And even the big food companies, executives are coming out to say this is unsustainable. They realize that now.
Well, yeah, I mean, they fought against it for a long, long time. And of course, now they're working at co-opting it for their benefit. But if it helps us get off the addictions to chemicals and the bioengineering, what people don't understand is that genetically modified organisms are genetically modified for the most part so they can tolerate ever higher amounts of poison in order to kill the bugs and weeds. Yeah. And that's what's bad about them. Not that they're genetically modified, but the reason for it. So anyway, I wrote an essay, and the next thing I knew, it had been translated into Chinese and published in the magazine of the People's Tribune, which is one of the major newspapers in China. And all of a sudden, I was this expert on organic agriculture. I said to my brother, who gave me a lot of research help because he was a major statistician at the United Nations, I said, I have no qualifications in this field whatsoever. And he said, oh, the Chinese don't care about that. They just care about good ideas. So I've actually done 2 Zoom presentations on it now since COVID hit at conferences in China. I haven't been back at this point, but that's how it all happened.
Wow. Well, that's a great example of how the ideas that we need now are percolating around the world. And if you can bring them to China, we can bring them back home too.
Well, I think what's going on now is that we're in a race between the forces of destruction and the solutions. The solutions are actually taking hold far faster than anybody thought they would. The climate crisis is emerging far faster than anybody predicted, too. So it's too soon to tell how it's going to turn out. But I think the tide has turned. We know that green energy has won the war. No question. I mean, they're going to cling to fossil fuels as long as they can get away with it. But it's now cheaper to do green energy everywhere in the world, including the U.S. It also is there's already more jobs in green energy in the U.S. than in all the fossil fuels put together right now.
Wow.
So that war has been won. We just can't see it as well. If anybody's ever watched a harbor at the turn of the tide where there are a lot of boats on moorings in the harbor, when the tide turns, you can't tell which way it's turning because the boats are all going in, 20 different directions. There's all these eddies and countercurrents and all this stuff. That's where we are right now. But the tide has turned.
I want to sum up what I've received from you, which I think is really valuable, and it's true in my experience. Bombarding people with facts doesn't help them change, but lifting up positive examples of how change can be in everyone's best interest and do wonderful things is very motivating to give people those positive examples, those positive stories. And before we wrap up, I want to be sure to name that particular episode that you mentioned with Judy O'Bannon. I've seen it, but I don't remember the title of it. So how do people find it?
It's on pbs.org, but if you just Google Judy O'Bannon, Courage, Brains, and Muscles, or Environmental Champions, any part of that, it'll come right up. It's still available.
It's a great example because there are little communities all over Indiana, which is not known as being a particularly green state, but people are doing wonderful things that are leading to health benefits, sustainability. So to take away this scarcity mindset that says, what do we do if we don't have fossil fuels? We won't be able to do anything. To lift up the positive stories of how working with nature as opposed to against nature is going to make us all happier and healthier. So why would we not want to do that? There are positive examples out there of how we can move forward to a sustainable world where we will have healthier communities, healthier individuals connected to each other and to nature. And it's possible, and people are doing it. Nations are doing it. Communities are doing it. Lifting up those examples is more motivating than saying, the tipping point is coming and it's already too late. That doom and gloom is not very motivating for most people. So thank you for lifting up what can move us forward in the direction we need to go.
Well, I hope it's helpful.
All right. Well, I think that's a great way to sum up. Thank you very much, Dr. Carol Johnston, and I hope people will look up the Judy O'Bannon documentary and your books. And I would love to read the article that was translated in China. We want to look to the ways that the tide will turn so that we can be the change. Absolutely.
Amen to that.
Thank you.
Yes.
Good to talk to you. Thank you for being here today for our podcast.
Bye-bye.